Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG Podcast. I am Ramon Mejia, here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews. And this week on the podcast, it is episode number 100. Yeah! That's right, everybody. It's episode 100 of the podcast we made. It's a great milestone. I think it's just a great thing that we were able to make 100 episodes of the show. That's almost 2 years worth of episodes. And it makes me feel a little old for some reason that we've hit almost 2 years of doing this podcast. But it's been really fun to do it with you. And I continue to hope to go to another 100, 200, 300, 400 until, I don't know, until the internet breaks. I don't know. But anyways, I have 10 new LitRPG reviews for you folks this week. Also, have the last set of winners for the LitRPG Podcast Giveaway, including a grad prize winner in LitRPG news. So I'll be announcing all that good stuff a little bit later in the show. But the LitRPG reviews that I have for you this week include Auger Augment, Blood of the Boundless, book number 1, and also Dungeon Deposed. Out of that will be a game called Quest. Then it's going to be The Quest, Last Gods, book 1, different books. Then The Lionheart, a LitRPG novel, No Respawn, book 1. Then it'll be The Barrow King, The Realms, book 1, a LitRPG adventure. After that, it's going to be Dragon Seed, a LitRPG Dragonrider adventure, the Archemi Online Chronicles book. There you go, long title. Out of that, it'll be Mitigating Risk, Nora Hazard, book number 1. Then it'll be Warriors Academy. This is the second book in that series, so it's episode 2. And then after that, last but not least, of course, it'll be Restart, Dark Paladin, book 3, which is apparently the last book in that series, according to the author's notes at the end. Okay, but first we go on to LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, we have just a couple stories, not a real heavy week in that regards. We have Dave Wilmarth is actually going to be giving away the first book in the Greystone Chronicles series for free. FREE. Some great letters that I love. Right up until 11:59 p.m. on March the 9th, 2018. So it'll be free from now until then. So you have plenty of time to grab it. And he's doing this basically to promote the release of the first audiobook in the series. So if you want to go pick that up as well, I'm sure he'll appreciate you grabbing the free version. Of course, the nice audiobook version as well. Great way to support a new author. Okay, now. That's really most of the LitRPG news I have to say. This is episode 100. We're celebrating 100 episodes on the podcast. We've been giving away stuff for the last few weeks, audiobook codes, digital copies of books, t-shirts, some sweaters from donators from other authors within the genre. And now it's time for the big ones, man. There have been a ton of great messages. Part of the contest was a way, I should say, to enter was to send in an email or a message to the podcast either through Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, wherever, just with a note of what you liked about the show, any moments that were special for you. And we had a lot of really great messages. Many of them just pointing out how much they appreciate the reviews and how much they help people decide what to read on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, especially for the folks who have limited budgets and you don't have Kindle Unlimited. When you are short on funds, it's a good thing to know if something's actual LitRPG or if it's really good in the way that you enjoy something. And so for readers or watchers and listeners who happen to share a very similar view of LitRPG and the things that they like and I like, apparently it's really helpful. So I'm happy for them and I'm happy to be helpful. Also, plenty of people love the author interviews. For a lot of people, that's the real gem in the series because they get to see the authors that they love and in no other real medium at this point is there any organization these are some great LitRPG authors. Ask them some questions, do some other interviews. Especially some people, especially the one Alaron Kong did. I've talked to him several times for the author interviews. Now he's more likely to just do a Facebook live event and talk to his readers directly. But we have quite a few of those. And of course, dozens and dozens, literally, other great LitRPG authors, even a few audiobook narrators as well, because that's a big part of this genre and people love narrators as well. One in particular a lot of people said they liked was the author LitRPG game that I hosted between Vasily Mihenko and Alaron Kong. That was actually Vasily Mihenko's idea to do it. And it was like him versus Kong, and it was supposed to be like kind of this fun competitive thing. And it was such a blast to be a part of and to watch. And eventually, like towards the end of the game, they dragged me into it with the watchers at that point, kind of being the judges, and it was just kind of a fun event all over. Also, viewers seem to like appreciate my amazing mad dance skills, so. I appreciate that back. All kinds of great things. Like I said, lots of love from the viewers and from listeners. So thank you everybody for sending these messages and being a part of the show, because you definitely are the reason I do this. Now, a couple messages in particular stood out to me as being like really like, making me sniffle. One in particular said, I can't say that I have a favorite podcast moment. However, I do have a preferred type of episode, and those are the author interviews. Michael Scott Earl, Dana Schinohofen, and the elusive D. Wolfen in particular were my topics. Despite D. Wolfen's connection issues, I can help that. Seeing the author who introduced me to LitRPG was a treat. Honorable mention goes to the DragonCon vid. Wait, hold on. I discovered the real life RPG reputation video, and I hereby add that as a second honorable mention to the list. Okay. And she goes on saying, appreciate that, that the passion that I have for the genre and for reading, shines through. So thank you very much. Also, this one was especially kind of touching as an author and writer myself. This particular viewer said, over the past couple episodes, you asked us to write in and tell you one of our favorite LitRPG podcast moments. For me, hands down, it's episode 50, your interview with Michael Scott Earl. This was by far one of the most epic, insightful, and motivational author interviews I've ever heard. He was a total eye-opener and the kick in the pant butt I needed to get back to writing on my first novel. Hearing both of your perspectives as authors working every day really shed the light on the path. Episode 50, this is the one that really changed things for me. So those are some great messages, I think, that encapsulate a lot of the feelings of the viewers and listeners. So thank you, everybody, for sending in your great, amazing messages. Thank you. Again, everybody who's been super supportive for the last 100 episodes, thank you very much. Whether it's been like supporters on Patreon who literally pay for this, and also like links, using the links we have in our reviews, that also helps pay for the podcast and the costs associated with it. Or even just like simple things like sharing the podcast on your social media, or liking the podcast on whatever medium you're watching or listening to it to. Even those things are just like really supportive, because it helps get the word out for the podcast and helps other people see our genre and helps them to find the joy of LitRPG like a lot of us have. And this podcast really doesn't exist unless you folks listen to it and you watch it and you support it. So thank you, everybody, for being so great and for letting me be a part of your lives for like an hour a week. Thanks a lot, everybody. Okay. Now putting the mushy stuff aside. Now to announce the big winners of our contest. Yes. Okay. So we have 3 winners, 2 runners up, which are like still really good like merch prizes. And then you have a grand prize. So our runners up are going to be Chad E. Milner and Mark Robert. They both win a signed copy of either Adventures on Terror or Project Alpha, which is written by me. So I'll give them personal messages and send them out to them. Additionally, they're also going to be getting a donated t-shirt from Dan Schinohofen, his Alpha Company t-shirts. Now, these are, of course, limited edition versions. There is like a small flaw in them that makes them super rare. So I don't know if you want to just mount them on the wall, put them in a bracket. Maybe they'll increase in value at some point. But they'll also get those as well. Now, the grand prize winner is Felicity. Felicity, also known as Andrew Edred's Don't Dream, I believe it is on YouTube. She is, she's the big grand prize winner. She has won a limited edition Alpha Company t-shirt, limited edition LitRPG Podcast t-shirt, and a limited edition Adventures of Terror t-shirt. These are t-shirts that basically I printed up just for like some stuff, and I had to make a lot of them. That's why they're very limited edition. Like almost nobody's ever going to have these probably. There's also a Miss Village sweater that Alaron Kong was nice enough to donate, and 3 signed novels from this guy, Auger Mejia. And of course, there's a whole $100 Amazon gift card, just as like the big reward thing. So folks, if you're winners, check your Facebook Messenger requests, your email spam folders, YouTube pages. I contacted people in a variety of different ways, so just make sure to go check if you're like, is that me? might be me. Go check. Because I've already contacted all the winners. I've heard back from some of them. So there you go. Okay, that's it for the contest. And again, thank you everybody for being such amazing and great supporters. So there we go. We're going to move on to our next section, which is just stuff that's out now. These are novels that are out currently. I haven't had a chance to read them. They've really just come up in the last couple of days. Now, just because of the last few weeks, there's been such a great number, like a lot of new LitRPG titles. I haven't been able to get through them all. I can only read about at most like 10 or 11 a week, depending on it. So there's still some ones from last week's show that came out that I haven't finished up. So I do plan to review them in the next couple of weeks, just making time to put everything together. But these are titles specifically that came out this week that you might not have heard about, including D. Wolfen's latest volume in the Chronicles of the Eternal. I kind of thought the author might have stopped writing, but then people reminded me, he writes on his webpage. So you can find a lot of his stuff there. You might also know him from some other series, but this was one that I thought was really interesting. It's like a sci-fi future fantasy twist thing. You'll go read it. It's fun. It's a good series. I haven't read the second one yet, but I really like the first one. So I'll look forward to catching this one this weekend. Also out now is Outpost, a LitRPG adventure, Monsters, Maces, and Magic Books 1 that just came out. And Dungeon Guild, this is the third book in the Glendaria Awakens trilogy. This is like a dungeon master story. It's called Dungeon Guild. Also out is a serialized short story LitRPG series called, this one titled The Slaver, and this is episode 2. So I kind of gave episode 1, I'm like, okay, this is kind of interesting, and so I'll read episode 2, see how it goes. Now in new LitRPG audiobooks, you have a couple titles here as well, including the Grayson Chronicles by Dave Wilmoth, which I've actually mentioned already. That's out as an audiobook now, so you can go check that out. Narrated by Sound Booth Theater. And Pangea Online, also narrated by Soundwave Theater. That one also is out as well as an audiobook. So there you go. You get 2 new titles this week for you. Okay, now in upcoming LitRPG, this is just where I read off all the stuff that's coming out in the next couple months. So you can feel free to skip ahead if you're not interested, but there are some new titles on this particular list. On March the 12th, it'll be The Crown and the Key. That's the 8th book in the Pharaoh book series, I should say. On the 15th of March, it'll be Primitive Online. Book 2 on the 15th of March, it'll be a new series from Dakota Kraut, author of the Divine Dungeon series. It'll be The Ritualist. On the 16th of March, it'll be Achilles' Reign, Paternia Online book number 4. Then it'll be on March 19th, Ghost in the Game. This is the 3rd book in that series. Now this one is actually also from Dave Wilmarth. This is a new series from his, so he has put down the Grayson Chronicles for the moment, and he's publishing this one on March the 30th. The man is writing very quickly. Called The Land of the Undying, The Dark Elf Chronicles, book number 1. So new series from him. On the 4th of April, it'll be Betrayal, book 2 in the Monster Maces and Magic book series. And let's see, on April the 10th, it'll be Absalom's Fate. Then on April the 23rd, it'll be Countdown, Reality Benders, book number 1. Now, this is from Michael Antonov. He's a Russian LitRPG writer. You might have read some of his other stuff already. So it's been translated into English, so always fun to read those. And then on May the 10th, it'll be Mightier Still. On May the 10th as well, Blind Gambit. On May the 17th, it'll be World of Karik, book number 2. That's another Russian translated novel, I believe. Also on May the 24th, it'll be God Mode, Alter Game, book number 3. On May the 27th, Kingdom Level 5. On May the 28th, it'll be the 2nd book in the Dragonriders series, the Archemi Online series, technically. Trial by Fire. So there you go. So that's as much as I know, folks, all the way up until May the 28th. Okay, on to new releases and reviews. Okay, first story is going to be Auger and Augment, Blood of the Boundless, book number 1, written by W.A. Bateman. So there you go. Now, the cover seems a little... the cover does not convey how good this novel is. I'll put it that way. So that's what I'm saying. And that is going to be, here you go. This is 319 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. I'll read you the author's description. the boundless promise of the opportunity to escape reality. But those who enter find that what the game offers isn't as simple as it appears. You can escape your job, and you can escape your family, but you can't escape human nature, and you can't escape yourself. Nathan Hill needs out of his family and out of his life. When he's offered just such an opportunity, he jumps to the chance. Still, software is still software, and humans are still human, and Nathan finds himself defenseless and facing a wild new world alone, full of danger, and every bit as complicated as the life he left. So there you go. Now the author has a content warning, I should say. It says this novel contains profanity, violence, and just a touch of the gay. I mean, that's what it says. Don't get mad at me. And again, the author does mention that there is a touch of the gay, which always makes you laugh for some reason. I don't know why. It's a very funny way of saying it. And all this really amounts to in the novel is a single kiss between two main characters and a discussion about like being gay by one of them. So don't miss out on this story because of that. Like I said, there's nothing graphic in here. There's no like sex or anything. But that's about as much as that goes. For me, it was like, it's whatever. But if it's not something you want to read about at all, I understand that as well. We all are adults who make choices about the things we enjoy, or the things we read about. There you go. Okay. Now for the review, the setup of how the main character gets in this game world is a little loose, but he's in the game by the 5% mark. So, but like the whole setup for it is like, that's a little bit, I'm like, that doesn't seem reasonable, but it's also pretty short, so you can kind of skip ahead if you want to. Once there, the main character finds his setup and character creation process aren't quite like the other players, but he does the best with what he can. The main character never in the story really becomes overpowered, but he does have some very unique powers and spells and abilities. And he kind of becomes, instead of like this overpowered main hero character, he becomes a very interesting support character. And that's really unusual for a lot of LitRPG. So like in a lot of LitRPG stories, like a lot of fantasy stories, the main character is the hero. He defeats everybody. He's the one who charges forward and leads the group. And that's not really the case here necessarily. A lot of those stories, like a slice of life description of how this, I don't want to say broken character, but a character definitely with some issues, is who's trying to run away from his problems and the things he that are wrong in his life into this game system. And he finds that he's still who he is. And he's not changing that necessarily by changing his environment. And there's some very interesting progression in that particular story that I really liked. But as far as like the game setup goes, there is potential in the setup for him to be super powerful later in the series. But right now, in this particular story, he's very weak. And I like the fact that he doesn't start off with some overpowered ability that just makes him unbeatable. In this particular story, he is very vulnerable, and I think that's part of the charm of this particular character, in my opinion. And I really like the way how the character develops and how he uses his powers and how he kind of discovers how the best way for him to fit into this world. Now, one of the things that makes this novel stand out for me is that the RPG game world is not set up to cater to players. Instead, the world is very much hostile to them. Like in a lot of MMO games and a lot of like stories about MMOs, the NPCs and the game world is basically set up as a playland for players, right? You go in, you get your quests, you can abuse the NPCs if you want to, like they're not going to say anything, they're just AI, whatever. In this world, the world is out to get the players, and the players are underpowered at this point. And at some point in the future that may change, obviously. But in this particular world, the world is ready for the introduction of these players, and it's very much aggressively hostile to them. Players kill players. There are tough monsters. There are even NPCs that take advantage of the players in the right situation. NPCs can and do. They cheat, they lie, they steal, and they definitely scam players. And there's a whole world full of fully developed NPCs with thousands of years of like their own history and culture. And so combat in this novel is also well described. But like the thing I thought was really interesting is the fact that this world they don't like players, and they do some very, I don't want to spoil anything, but like they do some very interesting things with them that I didn't see that coming, because I'm used to like that other storyline. Like, oh, the players come in and they're the focus and they're the ones who are super powerful because the world is created to cater to them. And that's not the case in the story. And I really did like that. Again, combat is really good here. The author, again, because the main character isn't like the overpowered hero, he does some very interesting tactical employments of abilities and skills. And the main character's friends are it's a very interesting group. the game mechanics in this novel are familiar, but there's still variation enough about unique skills and abilities to progress that is still very interesting to read about. The story, again, is mostly slice of life, following the main character as he explores the game world. There are dungeon knives, there's crafting, there's a little bit of intrigue, but the story also has some very neat and interesting twists. There are some seriously emotional moments in the story that are really, I mean, at least for me anyways, they touched a nerve. And there's like a particular section where the main character has to come to grip with his eternal conflict between like this ingrained belief system that he has from the real world, and the way he thinks he should be according to like the society in which he lived and who he really is. And for me, just in particular, it kind of resonated with like my own life events, and I think it'll resonate with a lot of other people. So overall, a really good story that had me genuinely like sniffling in a couple places. And I get to score 7 out of 10 for me. Like, it was definitely surprising. Like, whenever I read a new author, I'm always a little like, is this going to be LitRPG or is it not going to be? And this one was just like a good surprise. Like, oh, I haven't read this author before. This is the first novel I think that he's written, definitely in our genre of LitRPG. And it was like, really, I was like, oh, this is good. This is really nice. And I was like, yay. So there you go. Okay. So good job. That's a score of 7 out of 10 for Auger and Augment, the first book in the Blood and Boundless book series. So there you go. Good job, W.A. Bateman. Okay, on to our next story, Deposed by William D. Rand. Okay, this is 382 pages, $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. I will read you the author's description, which is super long. Riker has only one goal in his life right now: turn a certain adventuring guild into a flaming wreck while dancing merrily through their smoldering ruins, all for the chance to get back at a handful of people. It isn't as if they don't deserve it either. They had driven him from his home, chased him physically from the very guild house itself, all the way to the gates of the city, simply because he wasn't as strong as they expected him to be, as strong as he'd expected himself to be. He'd returned to the city the next day and left with means for revenge, something he'd hidden away and told no one about when he found it in his few dungeon knives, an inactive dungeon core. The crystal the size of a fist with a soul inside, one that could create anything from mana it wanted to, from monsters and complex cave systems to gold coins. Years are spent in planning and unfortunately farming as he waited. Now it felt like his moment was finally here. The dungeon core had been acting strangely, as if it were finally coming to life. Watching with the crystal like a hawk for this very event, Riker impatiently waits, any day now at its start, and he gets set about taking his vengeance. So there you go. This is like when I looked at this story and you look at the cover, you look at the description, I expected it to be a Dungeon Master story, and in part that is still true. There are a lot of people who really love this novel. There are tons of reviews. I think the author has something like 90 something reviews on Amazon as of this recording, and most of them are like 5 stars. And so it hits a lot of their buttons. For me though, there are lots of parts of the story that I really do like. And what the author does with the dungeon is innovative, and the main character is interesting and not your normal hero type. There's a good variety of fights. However, overall, the story just didn't land with me as well as I was hoping it was going to be. Again, not boring, not giving a bad score. It's just like, oh, it didn't get a 7, and there are reasons why. I thought, which will go into the review. Now, the very first thing I do with these novels is like, is this LitRPG? Anytime I read a story, that's the first question I ask, and I try to answer. And this one was kind of on the fence for me, and that's part of the reason why it didn't get as good a review as maybe other people thought it should. It's one of the things that I think about is in this novel, there is a game system. There are RPG mechanics, but a lot of the details of it are hidden away from the reader. They're not hidden away from the characters. Adventurers and monsters have these cards that they can show, basically character sheets that they can project so others can see them, and that show their stats, their levels, and their skills. And it's something that's referenced on a fairly regular basis in the story. However, the actual information on those cards is hidden away from the reader. So the reader never gets to see those character sheets, never gets to actually see, oh, what is the level of this character and what are their abilities and skill trees and all that kind of stuff. And for me, that's kind of the extent, or actually for the story, that's kind of the extent of the RPG system that's in the story. And I was kind of on the fence for a little while saying, is this a LitRPG story? Because is it hiding the RPG mechanics from the reader? And that's very much part of the general definition of what LitRPG is for a lot of readers is it is set in a game world or a world with game mechanics that is expressly stated. which means it's not hidden from people. And the same thing with like, the second part is that, the main character, the character should grow in power according to those game mechanics established, again, in an expressly stated way. And the things and the way that they grow in the RPG mechanics aren't hidden from the readers, because that's kind of thing that distinguishes LitRPG from general fantasy, is that the game mechanics aren't hidden, and that we see the numbers, we see the stats, we see the RPG progression, because that's some of the things we love from tabletop games, from RPG games, is that those things are familiar and they give us a sense of like actual quantifiable progression and a world that makes sense, because there are actual rules that both the reader and the characters can't see. And that is kind of here. And so for me, eventually I talked to some other people and like, I decided, yes, this is LitRPG, and there is an RPG system. It's referenced throughout the entire novel, the characters' levels and classes and specific powers, and it is part of the world. And it's just because I would love to have seen more details, or even like some details at all, doesn't mean that the RPG system is hidden from it. The fact that I'm even talking about it means, okay, it's in the novel and it's talked about fairly openly. And it's just that the details aren't there as far as like, what's an actual class number? What are these actual descriptions? What are these actual character trees? They're like these class trees. All that is hidden, and that's unfortunate. And that's mostly the reason why I didn't enjoy the novel as much as I should. But that doesn't mean that this is not LitRPG. Now on to some of the more specific parts of this novel. The dungeon master stuff in the story is there. It's interesting. The main character does plant a dungeon, and he takes control of it, and he designs it, he populates it with monsters, all that good stuff, and the main character has a detailed plan for the dungeon so he can get the revenge. And it's not a standard hack and slash dungeon either. There's some very interesting stuff like with creating story-based levels in the dungeon that I thought were really cool, and that the matter of fact the main character can absorb class skills and abilities from the people he kills, and use them to create more complex monsters. All really cool, very interesting stuff. I'm not going to spoil too many details, because that part I thought was really, really quite good. However, most of the Dungeon Master story disappears by the 35% mark in the story. And that was a little sad to me, because that's the thing that drew me into the story. And the fact that it basically goes away, the thing that I kind of like the best about it, and the thing that, I think that for me at least, that I thought this was going to be, I was like, okay, that just kind of lessened my enjoyment. Some other people they loved it, they don't care. And at that point, after the 35% mark, the story becomes more focused on like politics and intrigue, and both the queen of their country and her rivals vie for control of the dungeon, through marriage and sex with the main character, and it becomes a little more harem-y at that point. And look, I wanted to like the story. I did. William D. Rand is a good writer. I like a lot of his other stories. It's just that, this story just lost some of the things that I really enjoy about LitRPG, or just like what I liked about this story in particular. Like the Dungeon Master stuff, again, disappearing after the 35% mark for the most part. As far as like the development of the dungeon, like the dungeons still exist, and it's still part of the story as far as like things the main character does, but like his actual development cycle, that's kind of gone, at that point. And I'm just personally not a huge fan of political intrigue stories. It's just not my kind of thing. That coupled again with the severe lack of like details as far as the RPG system goes, it just made it less interesting to me, and that's cool. Not every story is for everybody. Had even like one of those things kind of been developed more, it probably would have gotten a 7 out of 10. But it wasn't. And so this one just didn't land for me. While it wasn't home for me, if you like those things, if you like political intrigue, if you're not expecting a full Dungeon Master story, or if you prefer like super, super, super light RPG stuff, then you'll probably like this a lot more than I did. It didn't land for me. So for me, it gets a score of 6 out of 10. That's Dungeon Deposed, with a score of 6 out of 10. So there we go. Okay, on to our next story. It's going to be a game called Quest, a retro LitRPG novel by S.J. Larson. So there we go. It is 126 pages for $3.99, and it's available on Kindle Unlimited. So first off, I'll say that's way too expensive. that's way too expensive for 126 pages. But I'll read the author's description to you, and we'll get into the review. March 16th, 1982, a day that Donnie has been waiting and planning for. Launch day for Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. But an early start, endless queuing, and a mad dash to mad dash comes to nothing when bully Brian, who has been after Donnie for years, steals his copy in the store. In an effort to cheer Donnie up, his older sister Amanda takes him and his newfound compadre Kevin to an odd little shop downtown where the shopkeepers rents and them an Atari game called Quest, and it is nothing that the three have ever seen before. They become sensually immersed in a world of Kitaria with the shopkeeper's 3D control contraption hooked to Donnie's Atari, and in this world, Donnie, Amanda, and Kevin must defeat the evil overlord Centaria and bring peace to the lands for the elves, freeing them from the oppression of the Dark Elves. While they race to finish the game, Brian and his cohorts try to keep the unlikely trio from finishing the game's quest to free the elves. Donnie must not only save Kentaria and Earth, but find a way to stop Brian's ongoing torment. So there we go. That's the author's description. Now, a lot of the story, the real storyline, kind of depends upon nostalgia to be interesting, but it does it really well. I'll just say the story is set in 1982, and the bit of nostalgia is combined with the kind of trapped in the game, transported to the game world kind of story. And like I said, it does the nostalgia part really well with all the correct references and great descriptions of the town. The town felt really flushed out. I mean, there's Pac-Man, there's alligator t-shirts, there's Atari. And I mean, that's, like I said, it landed really well with me as far as the real world storyline. Unfortunately, the game part didn't do as well. The kids in the story are sent to a game world where there's an evil bad guy they have to beat up, and they're sent in a series of quests to gather allies to face him. When they first get there, they're given roles as a warrior, a mage, and an archer, and allowed to choose between 3 specific races. However, they aren't given a lot of choices. Like once one character chooses to be a dwarf warrior, okay, that both the race and the class are eliminated from the options for the other characters. So it feels very much like that Gauntlet style of gaming, where like, oh, there are just these preset classes with abilities, and that distinct lack of agency, even in the like the character choicing for these characters, is kind of the theme for the game world. Unfortunately, the main characters have a distinct lack of choice in this story. They're given like these on the road quests where they are said, oh, go to this particular place and find this dude, and they do some leveling on the way. And once they get like, oh no, now you have to go to this place and find this guy, and he'll tell you what to do next. And it's very much like on the rail questing, and the characters and the kids, I should say, are never really given any choice on how they develop their characters. They're just given abilities and levels when they complete these quests, and there are whole swaths of levels that are literally skipped in the story. Like the main characters go from level 2 to 21 in the space of a few pages with no real details how they got there, and it's kind of assumed that they just did some grinding on some ice methods or something, on the ice imps. So there's really no choice in the story as far as the game systems go. There's no depth to the system, and to me, that's kind of the biggest issue with it. The game part is kind of boring because of it. The game stuff might be referencing like the kind of games from the 1980s where there just wasn't space on the technology to do these in-depth stories or the in-depth game systems. And that's completely valid choice. And it kind of meshes in with the theme of like the 1982 nostalgia story. However, the novel also does something interesting in that they essentially introduce virtual reality gaming system in the story. Like they make the characters put on these gaming goggles, and they still might use joysticks, but they also like speak into the game, and the characters speak back to them. So there's almost an introduction of like this VR gaming system into this 1982 world. And if that can be there, like why couldn't the author implement a better game system too? So it never really kind of mesh for me in that respect. Overall, I think the story really did have promise. The werewolf storyline, again, really engaging. I genuinely feel bad for the kids when they were bullied and when things turned around at the end. I was like, yay! But the RPG game stuff just wasn't developed, and that's the majority of the story. So I'm like, oh well, this wasn't entertaining for me. So for me, it gets a score of 5 out of 10. That's going to be a score of 5 out of 10 for a game called Quest, a retro lit RPG novel. There we go. Okay, on to our next story, next review, The Quest. Last God's Book, #1 by Linton Bowers. Definitely like the cover art, very nice. It is 197 pages, $1.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited, so very nicely priced as far as, my opinion is. And here's the author's novel description, which is super short. When Jason receives a beta immersion virtual reality game rig, he does suspect he will be transported No, let's just say he does not. But that's not what it actually says. It says he does suspect that he will be transported into a game with no way to log back out or go back home. Nor did he think that he would end up a slave forced to fight for his gremlin masters. So there you go. There are, of course, a few issues with some grammar in the story. So it is what it is. Full disclosure, I also received an advance copy of the story for review from the author. I purchased it when it became available. Okay, the review itself. There are a lot of good things with the story that I liked, actually. It's a little bit ambiguous whether this is a transported to a game world story or if it's a trapped in the game story. It kind of goes back and forth where nobody really knows. But there are definitely plenty of RPG rules in this story. Everyone's aware of them. Everyone follows them. So it's definitely RPG. With the exception of like some of the combat, and that's kind of where it drew me away from. But I'll get into that explanation in a second. First off, the main character, Jason Action, tries out the latest VR system and finds himself captured and forced to fight in a virtual fantasy world as a gladiator. That's how the story starts. The fights are over the top. I don't want to mention why that bothers me again. But for the most part, this is a really solid story. The main character is one of the many players being captured and enslaved as they come into this virtual world. He makes friends and allies with other captured players, and their relationship building is really well done in the story. The story itself doesn't have a definite conclusion, and it's a little more slice of life, so just be aware of that going in. And it feels like it's part of a serialized story in that, things are going to be progressing later in the story. So the author's like planning out the novel. There are some loose threads, of course, that hopefully be developed later in the series. And this includes like a whole second narrative story about some guy named Larian that doesn't have anything to do with the main character and doesn't actually meet him. There's literally like two stories here. One is for the main character and one is for Larian. And the chapters like switch back and forth. And Larian is an NPC in this world who's a shepherd and he does some alchemy skills, I guess. And part of the story is like his life in this world, and then bad things happen, and that's towards the end. But that story literally does not cross with the main character's story. So it's a little weird to me. And like I said, that's why it makes me feel like it's a little serial. And then, maybe that's a story that's going to be played out later in book 2 or 3 or whatever. But game mechanic wise in the novel, you could tell the author really did put a lot of effort in creating like this nice, balanced system. The main character trains and he gains new skills. He has can get new abilities from training, and he increases stats from training. At the same time, he even learns magic at one point in the story, but he has to grind up the skill levels to it to make it useful. When the main character levels, he only has a very few stat points and skill points, so he kind of has to be careful about where he distributes those points. Now, unfortunately, that so you can tell the author puts a lot of hard work into it, and the amount of like information he gives and like the skill trees and like the things that can happen. But that balance essentially disappears as soon as like real combat is initiated. And that made me so sad when I read like the first like real fight in the novel. In the first real fight, when the main character's in the gladiatorial arena, which is I sort of pictured on the cover, the main character's level 1. And he one-shots an opponent so much more powerful than him that his level appears as like level ? Which later on in the story is revealed like, that means that character is at least 30 levels higher than you if you can't see their level when you like look at them or you examine them. Which means that first monster he fought was at least level 31, and he one-shotted it with a spear he stole from a guard. And the monster literally just like gets speared and he explode. So like there's not even like any fallback of like, he swiped at the character and murdered him. None of that happens. And I was hoping that, maybe it's just a one-off. Maybe that first one is meant to grab the reader's attention and that, everything will balance out. Because a lot of the rest of the novel is like when he does his training, when he does his all that stuff, it's really detailed and it's really balanced. And he doesn't seem like he's an overpowered character. But unfortunately, in every single fight where the main character is not training, it just doesn't make sense according to like the game rules that are already established. Like he ends up later on in the novel, in the story, one-shotting a whole group of higher level characters who have full plate armor, and he's using a sword he just picked up and he has no skill for. And it just seems like the author is so focused on making these fight scenes over the top and like that he kind of just ignores the RPG game rules he's established. And to me, like that just makes me sad because it makes those rules seem like they don't matter. And that's kind of one of the things I love about the LitRPG is that, the rules matter. They're like physics. Like you don't ignore gravity when you're writing a story. Like it's a fundamental concept in your story, because it's like an unbreakable. Like you can bend it. There's some variations if you get technical, but if your RPG game rules aren't like that in your world, what's the point of having? If you're just going to wand wave, your hero into success every single time, even though it makes no sense level wise, like comparatively, why they should win. What's the point? You know what I mean? And that just makes me less interested in your story. And again, it's just kind of a shame, because for most of the story does have very balanced rules, and you can, like I said, you can tell they thought they put a lot of time and effort into creating that balance. And I mean, it's his story. He can do whatever he wants. It's just a shame that he ignores it for just some good fights, because then it makes me feel as a reader like, oh, all that stuff I loved about your story doesn't really matter. And that's what it is. So for me, again, not a bad story, not getting a bad score necessarily. It's just I couldn't enjoy it once I realized, oh, he's always going to win. He's always going to be all this over the top fighting that doesn't make sense according to the game rules that have been established, and whatever. And my gamer brain just wouldn't let me ignore it. But if you can, go read this. If you can ignore that stuff, it doesn't matter to you. If you just love the over the top fight scenes for what they are, you'll probably have a better time. It's just my gamer brain can't ignore it when like math doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? So that's my brain. So for me, got the score 7 out of 10. Sorry, 6 out of 10. I just couldn't enjoy it as much. But again, not bad, not boring in any way, shape, or form. So we get score 6 out of 10. That's The Quest, The Last Gods, book number 1, with a score of 6 out of 10. So there you go. Okay, on to review number 5. This one is The Lionheart, No Respawn, a LitRPG series, book number 1 by Stephen Collier. There you go. It is 280 pages, currently 99 cents. It is available on Kindle Unlimited, so great price point. Author's description. Tharis doesn't know who he is, what he is, or what he will do. All he knows is that he must fight and kill, as that is what his IRL players tell him to do. Soon, Tharis realizes he can taste, feel, and even think on his own, with life becoming more real every second. Tharis finds that he can take control of his own destiny, literally, against the will of his creator. Yet all the decisions have consequences, and with awareness comes the fear of death, or for Tharis, there is no respawn. So there you go. That's the concept here. Now, the author, Stephen Collier, is actually known as a fantasy writer, and this novel tries to combine like an awakened AI story with an MMORPG storyline, and unfortunately, it doesn't really work out, to me at least. You can tell that the author has a lot of gaming experience as far as like creating the MMORPG experience. Great. However, he ultimately sacrifices the significance of the game world for the story. And I'll get into why. As I read the story, basically, it kind of became evident that the game mechanics in the real world couldn't be ignored any single time in the story if the author needed a particular story event to go a certain. And again, this is kind of a theme from the last novel as well, in that when you ignore the game rules you set up, it's like you're ignoring physics, and it makes the story feel less interesting, at least to me, because again, it's like you're ignoring the rules you've set up for your world in just to create a particular story moment. And that to me just doesn't, makes my brain hurt. And so I can't enjoy that kind of story. And a lot of the story basically ends up being fluff because of that. Like you can read the first 23%, very nicely done. I like that part. And then you can skip to the 41 to 44% mark, read that little section, and then skip to 86 to 89 and read that section. And you got all the story that really matters to what the author's trying to tell you. Those are the big moments of the big reveals, and you get all the big information, and everything else kind of feels like RPG themed filler. Because again, when your game rules don't matter for your big story points, when the RPG system, even is like really well done, and as is the case here, it's detailed. If it doesn't matter, like really in the story, like, oh, then they don't matter to you as the author, even if you put the time in to like make them. And that's just kind of what this is. Now I'm going to get a little spoilery here in a second, because I'm giving like specific details about where this happened and what this occurred and examples. So if you don't want to hear that, if you want to read the story, just know that I give this a score of, I believe it was a 6 out of 10. Yeah. Oh, sorry. 5 out of 10. Really. Yeah. So you give it a 5 out of 10. You can skip ahead. So there's your warning, spoilers read. Okay. Now, the novel starts out with the main character being created in an MMORPG. He's a blank character, yet he's somehow aware that someone else is making all the choices about his race, his appearance, his class, and his gender. And then he's dropped into a world as Theris, the level 1 half-elf warrior, even though he'd rather be an architect. And the story starts off from the main character's point of view. Like he's looking at all these things happening around him. Like he's seeing himself as a blank slate and someone making his face look a certain way. And he's seeing character options and choices, and you're giving information about classes and races in the story. But the main character's all at this point narrating the story, saying, I'm not deciding these things. I'm learning about them, but someone else is making these decisions for me. So very, very quickly in the story, you realize, oh, this is like an awakened artificial intelligence avatar or whatever it is. And that's kind of the theme in the novel. That's the story that's really being told in this particular, novel. Now, up until like the 23% mark of the story, the story follows this main character as he goes through a series of quests. He levels up, gets new gear, and there's a very interesting story in the first portion of it that on its own will actually be a really good story. Like the first 23% all by itself would probably get a 7 out of 10. Like it's nice, it's well done. Even though there are like a few conflicts, the main character doesn't have, well, the way it's described, like the main character is aware that he's being controlled, but at the same time, he's not really making decisions that are trying to conflict with those. So the way it's written, it's like just like he's doing regular adventuring, regular speaking to other characters, and it's not 100% clear whether or not the other players in the story are like him, whether they're like just avatars that have their own mindsets but aren't aware that they're being controlled. That's a little iffy, and that's kind of a theme in this whole story. But the first plotline is that the beginner town is being essentially held hostage by a PK player, being Toxin, and he's killing any character who goes above like level 10, so that he's never challenged, and he's making everybody pay him a tax. And it's this whole like interesting PK story that I thought was really interesting. However, as good as I thought the first 20% was, there are like these other themes, and like the main character can kind of, if he starts questioning reality around him, starts seeing the code behind the world. And at the same time, there's plenty of good RPG questing and stuff. And just during this section, I just thought it was weird because there's like even there's a lot of information about, class and different ability skills and trees and skill trees and all the things. There's a distinct and a deliberate lack of depth about like, XP that's being awarded. Like when the main character takes quests, he says, one of your awards are going to be XP and a specific thing, like 23 silver or a specific item. But and then when he finished the quest, it was like, he got a reward of XP without giving an actual number, which I thought was a little weird because the author didn't have a reason. He gave numbers for everything else. He wasn't hiding level numbers. He's not hiding like specific damage numbers necessarily. He gives them off as like percentages. And he's not hiding like the amount of like rewards people are getting. So it felt weird that he would hide like the amount of experience points that was offered and given to the main character. But beyond that, it's just a little weird. And the fact that you don't ever see like a character sheet, I'm like, okay, those are just choices, I guess. And again, at the 23% mark, the main character, again, this is a little spoilery, is about to be, him and his friends are about to be killed by the bad guy Toxin. And then like the main character uses like his Neo-like powers to question the system. And he's like, what's the point of life? Why are we here? And the system freaks out, and it starts like, you see like the numbers behind things. And he uses that to kind of get out of this death situation. He like jumps through the floor into like the river system beneath. And that's how he saves. He's about to die. And the author kind of magic wand waves him into safety. And at that point, I kind of realized, the game stuff doesn't matter. The rules, the whole system, it doesn't matter. And this kind of confirmed like very shortly in the novel and the story, where it's like, now the main character suddenly has these powers we never saw. Like he can talk to animals and trees and get quests from them. And in the novel, he even gets arrested by his own faction, and is forced to power level to like level 19. There's total level skipping here, where it goes from like, I think it's 7 to 19 suddenly, or like something like that. And then he's sent back to the village to face up against Toxin, and their final conflict, like the fight between the two, it kind of just ended my interest in the story. I finished the novel, but it was like, it doesn't matter in a lot of ways. In that there's again some very serious wand waving that happens during this fight. Again, just as the main character is about to die, he's forced to kill his friend who's a player, or player character, I should say, and it's just enough experience points to level him, and he refills his health, and he earns a legendary subclass, and he auto-equips magically protective armor, and he beats the bad guy, and it's all very yay for the good guy, you beat the bad guy that we didn't like. At that point, I kind of realized why the author never showed how much XP the character gets or needs to level. Otherwise, this specific scene could never be possible, because if you have an already established system, like, oh, you need so much XP to level to like 10, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, and you show how much experience points the main character is getting per fight or per quest, it's highly unlikely that you could arrange for the main character to level in just a specific way so he gets all his XP back and he gets all the class information, and to have this particular event occur. And I'm like, oh, okay, so yeah, I'm absolutely correct in that the game stuff doesn't matter when it comes to the story events that the author wants to portray. And I'm not saying this is a bad story. I'm saying it didn't work for me because, again, the game stuff that I love, the RPG mechanics, even though they're fairly well described, don't matter in the story. Like, they really don't. Like, I already know enough. Like, you can skip all the other things. Like, I gave you the points where the main events occur, and this includes this one, and you'll get like, you essentially get like 99% of the story. Like, the rest of it is just kind of filler. And that's the way it felt for me, because once I realized that, oh, this game stuff doesn't matter, the RPG system that I love and is presented here, it's always going to be ignored if the author needs a story to go a certain way, and it does several times later as well. And then it's like, oh, it's just not interesting to me, and it felt like filler. So, and again, more of the story, the main character gets some more levels, he gets some specialized skills, equipment, finding more people like him, and it all culminates at the 86% mark where he finally gets the answers, what he's looking for, like what this world is, what his event is, like who's initiating the whole thing. And that's kind of the real, like, gist of the story. Like, that's the story that the author's telling of an awakened AI and what's happening in this world, which is, again, not a horrible, none of that story within of itself, it's just that the RPG stuff doesn't matter in the novel ultimately. And again, doesn't have anything. And after the 89% mark on the novel, it's actually the end. And the last 11% of this thing is literally just filler. It's the author's other fantasy story, which is nothing to do with LitRPG. So like, that's why I feel like, oh, it has nothing to do with this novel or LitRPG. So it's filler to me. Overall, again, I like the first quarter of the story by itself. That story it's good. It doesn't break that immersion level in that first 23%. Like, it feels like the game stuff matters, even though later on you realize it doesn't. But again, once it became evident to me, at least, that the game rules don't matter to the story, like they're just kind of there to like be LitRPG or to be, whatever the author thinks it needs to be, and it can be ignored whenever the story needs to go a certain way. Like, I just lost interest. And again, you can just like get the main points when reading the first 20%, 41 to 44, and 86 to 89, and that's like essentially the real story. So again, just wasn't entertained. So for me, it gets score 5 out of 10. Kind of boring, again, because most of the story just like felt like it didn't matter. That's 5 out of 10 for Lionheart, a LitRPG novel, no Respawn book number 1. There you go. On to review number 6. This is going to be Barrow King, The Realms Book 1, a LitRPG adventure written by C.M. Carney. This is, again, another new author to the genre. This is his first LitRPG novel. He messaged me a couple times saying he has a whole series plan. He has cover art for all of it. And again, every time I read an author that I haven't read before, I'm always like very like, is this going to be a thing? Is it really LitRPG? And thankfully I like this one. It was really nice. It is 452 pages. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't let you know that there were some launch issues for this novel. Like, there were some serious spelling and grammar errors, and like I think the wrong version went up at one point. And so that is reflected in some of the reviews for the novel on Amazon. You'll see a lot of those kind of comments. The author has told me that he's fixed all that, that it's a much better version for whatever technical reasons. There were snafus, but your mileage may vary. I didn't notice too many issues, a few grammar and spelling errors personally, but you might have a different version. Again, 452 pages, $4.99, available on Kindle Unlimited, so great price point. Here's the author's description. Betrayed by those closest to him, Finn Caldwin thought he'd escaped his life of violence and deception, but when a frantic message from his estranged sister draws him into the realms, the world's most advanced holographic reality game, Finn is forced to embrace his deadly skills once again. Armed with the mysterious artifact known as a godhead, Finn becomes the warrior mage Griff. Yet, things are not as they seem, and to save his sister, he must escape a sentient dungeon by defeating its master, the Barrow King. Okay, so there are two portions of this novel. One is the real life stuff that gets him into the game, and the rest of it is just the part that I liked. The novel starts out as a cyber thriller kind of theme, where the main character, Finn, who's a former spy for some reason, he sent a message by his sister. She's been missing for the last 6 months and is trapped in a game created by the most immersive VR game creator, and it's all very cyber thrillery, very, very cyber thrillery. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. Like literally, it's a whole long setup that maybe it'll pay off in the longer series. But for now, it's just a way to get him in the game, and all that cyber thriller stuff really doesn't impact the game portions of which is the rest of the novel at all. It's just it's motivation for him to continue to fight and to try to save his sister who's trapped in the game. But ultimately, it doesn't really impact the actual story very much, at least for now. Now, there's also this whole weird subplot that the game is really a portal to an alternate dimension where the world is ruled by game mechanics, and the CEO of the company used beta players to take over and then advance that universe by 200 years once he was the god of that universe. And honestly, that whole thing does not make sense at all, like in any way, shape, or form. And I'm just going to choose to ignore it because I really did like the rest of the novel. After character creation, which takes too long, it's like 40 pages long of character creation stuff, which is, I don't think you need that much. The rest of the story is just a dungeon dive. And that's the part that, to me, this novel is best at. When it's just being a dungeon dive story where it's this interesting character who has a fine backstory. You get insight into like the main character, how he uses his unique abilities and special items that'll make him a god eventually, but he's not too overpowered now. He has to collect some party members, but it's still just a dungeon dive story, and that's good. This is fine. The story is a little bit flawed in that some of the fights are like a little wand wavy. Like at one point, he's a level 1 character, and he fights a level 21 character, and he beats it somehow. But unlike some other novels that I've reviewed in this story, that's a rarity. It's not every single fight. And even the way he's fighting this level 21 character is like he's struggling the heck out of it. And he's trying everything he can as like this good fighter in the world to beat this monster who, and honestly, he shouldn't win it. But I'm like, there are like 2 instances where like, oh, there's some wand waviness here, like where he shouldn't really beat this kind of character. But for a lot of other fights in the novel, they're really well balanced. Like he gets his butt kicked a couple times by like just characters like monsters who are his own level, but like they outnumber him like 5-1 or whatever. And so I think that kind of balances out for me. Like I'm okay with like an occasional wand wave, but like if it's every single fight, I'm like the game stuff doesn't matter then at that point. But that's kind of not the case here, which is why this story was different for me. Now, also, there's a little bit of a loot issue in that the main character kind of probably gets too much loot. But that's the thing to adjust or to ignore. But beyond that, most of the story is really good. Like the fights are well balanced for the most part. They're well described. There's good depth like to other characters and their classes and what they can do. And the magic system is really in depth, and I liked it a lot. And like also it's super crunchy, and like there's tons of information, or sometimes maybe a little too much in the character creation portion. But you always feel like in this story, like, oh, I could play this game. I can live in this RPG world. And like I said, with the exception of like a couple fights, everything in the RPG system matters, and the main character can lose, and he can die, and that's a core part of the system in that he's not the best yet. He can potentially be in the future, but the RPG stuff matters in most of this story, and that's why it's different for me than the other reviews I gave, in that it feels like it matters. And even though again a couple fights are one wavy as all heck, and the math doesn't quite fit up. Overall, those are 2 out of like maybe a dozen fights. And I'm like, okay, that's relative. Like, okay, I'm okay with that for some reason. So for me, had a good time with the story. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. Gets a score of 7 out of 10. That's The Barrow King, The Realms, Book 1, a LitRPG adventure with a score of 7 out of 10. So there you go. Next. Okay, another one from another new author to the genre. This one is called Dragon Seed, a LitRPG Dragonrider adventure, the Archemi Online Chronicles book, written by James Osiris Baldwin. So there you go. What a lovely cover. Okay, this one is 426 pages. It is $4.99. It is also available on Kindle Unlimited, so great price point. Here is the author's description. What would you give to be a Dragonrider? Before being conscripted to fight in the Total War, Private Hector Park had a shattered family, a collection of old video games, and a promising career as a motorcycle stuntman. Now, he's dying from a virus threatening humankind with extinction, and he has 3 days to live. When Hector's brother contacts him after years of hostile silence, Hector goes to try and make peace. But his brother has an offer even more unbelievable than reconciliation: a chance to cheat death by joining him at Archemi, a full immersion fantasy VR RPG video game. Determined to forge a life worth living, Hector undergoes the experimental upload process and chooses the difficult path of the Dragon Knight. To achieve his dream, he must prove himself worthy of imprinting a dragon, a being with whom he will share a telepathic bond more intimate than any human relationship. Okay, so there you go. That's the author's description. And honestly, the beginning of this novel, I would skip it. Like it's kind of the thing I least like about the story. And that's not that it's badly written or anything, or that it's not. It develops a lot of real world stuff and emotional connections and backstory that ultimately are repeated elsewhere in the novel. So it feels redundant in a lot of different ways. And what you read in the description is kind of all the information you need to know about the world. Like basically at the 12% mark, he's being uploaded into a game. So is his brother. Only one of them makes it. Guess who? And that's kind of all you need to know. Like all you really need to know is the main character has a disease that's killing him, and that his brain is uploaded into this full immersion beta VR MMORPG. And everything else about the world is touched upon elsewhere in the story. So like a lot of the first 12% feels redundant. And I mean, that was probably the most common comment when I was reading through reviews of the novel, and that they say, "Oh, the beginning is kind of slow," and I agree, and that's kind of the reason I don't like it as much as the rest of the novel. So I would honestly suggest read the novel description. That's all you really know about the world, and skip to the 12% mark. You'll save yourself it'll be like a much more interesting story. Now, so the rest of the novel is good. I mean, like surprisingly good. Like from the cover, I kind of expected this to be a high fantasy, barely literary story that was depending upon like a Dragonrider Japan vibe to be interesting, and I couldn't have been more wrong. Like really, this is not only like a super crunchy LitRPG where there's like tons of information and details. It flows really well, but there's also surprising depth to both the game mechanics and the world building. And I was genuinely fascinated for most of the story. I was like, this is really good. And after character creation of the novel, the main character is dropped into the game, and he's a slave on a magically powered airship, and he has to figure out some way to escape. I'm like, that's a really good beginning, because it sets a really interesting tone. Like, oh, this world has magic tech, and it's not just another high fantasy story with dragons and knights and mages and whatever. Instead, the fundamental structure of this novel is somewhere more towards like magic tech. I'm like, that's really good. And even though like the magic tech isn't like a big feature in this novel, the fact that you learn about it and that it's possible in other nations kind of leaves a lot of interesting things for the author to describe and to do later on with the main character. And again, there's just like a lot of depth to this whole system. And it just wasn't what I expected. I was like very pleasantly surprised by what it was. Now on the game side of things, again, there's a ton of depth. Like there's a lot of information there. There's tons of notifications, ability descriptors, character sheets, demo notifications, anything you could think of as far as like things you would like to see as far as RPG game goes. It's here. There's their actual damage numbers, there's actual experience points given, and you know exactly how much it takes to level. And so you feel like all this information, there's way more information that you need here to roll your own character. And that's always a good thing when I read it. So if there's enough information in this story that I could roll my own character there, that's good. To me, at least, as a reader, because that means the author is providing enough backstory in the game mechanics that it feels real, as far as like the things the main character can do, and this does a really good job in that respect. Now, the other aspect that I thought was like really cool and surprising is again the depth to the to the world building. And I forget real quick, there's also like some really cool stuff in the story, like the game stuff is like there's also in the first half a very interesting survival game mechanic aspect, and also crafting. I'm a big sucker for crafting, I know, but crafting actually plays a really important part in this role because there are no healers. There's no like mage healer class. So crafting becomes a really important part of this world, and it's, the gameplay stuff. Now, depth of world building. Again, very surprising. There's a ton of distinct cultures in the world, different races, different nations, and they each have their own history, their own influences, their own biases against each other, their distinctive ways of they dress, and their own traditions, and even hairstyles. I was genuinely surprised, like, oh, the author took the time to describe the main character's his character's nationality. They have their own way of tying their hair and like braiding in bows. And just like a lot of tiny details like that showed like the main character, the author took a ton of time to research and to make each one of these cities, each one of these races, each one of these cultures distinct and interesting. And I definitely, as somebody who appreciates world building, appreciates that particular aspect of the story immensely. I guess just like again, surprised at how much I really enjoyed the novel and that particular aspect of it. Now I should be honest, like this novel should be broken up into two different parts. Like the first part, the actual author says book 1, and from the 50% onto then it says book 2, which is why this is a volume 1 in the series. But in that second arc of the story, in that second book, some of those in-depth portions kind of fade away a little bit as the story shifts from just like introducing you to this like huge big world where they're like Dragonriders and a bunch of different races who reward each other, and this big gigantic quest system like, oh, saving everybody from like the evil barred away evil dudes. It kind of shifts into like a slightly smaller story where it's a little more military based, and the main character is basically trying to fulfill like that promise at the beginning of the description of becoming a Dragonrider, and that's where that focuses. But it also means like it's a smaller scope of the story. The main character for like the second half of the novel is basically in a military camp, and he's with a lot of the military bros, especially other players who are also like have a military background. But it definitely feels a little more grindy in that they have a very specific task and a set of quests. But at the same point, there's also more development about like what's happening with the larger game world, and there's some surprise twists on the story, and it's still very interesting. It's just not as world building necessarily. And also some of I should say there's simply less game mechanics in the second half. It's not like they're not there, they're not interesting, or they're not important. And it's just that compared to the first half, I go, this one definitely scaled back a little bit. But still, overall, the story had plenty of twists, plenty of turns, and plenty interesting surprises. I really did like it. I would say like the first book 1, like the first half of the story, 8 out of 10, easy. The second half scaled back to 7 out of 10, just because it became a little less game focused. Like the amount of information about like skill trees and experience points and all that just scaled back a little bit. It was noticeable to me. Still very good interesting story, just not as in depth world building wise and like game mechanic wise as the first half was, for me at least. Overall, again, I had a really good time reading the novel. I look forward to reading the next one in May when the next one comes out. And overall, I get a score of like 7 out of 10. Like if I was to average them, it'd be like 7.5. Like I really did enjoy the story. It was a huge surprise as much as I liked it. Like I said, I might have gone into a little bit biased. I just read like a few other stories that didn't work out. And I was like, oh, the cover gives me an impression of something. And it was just like a big surprise, like how different it was from what I was expecting, and in a very good way. So for me, score of 7 out of 10. That's Dragon Seed, a LitRPG Dragonrider adventure. The Archemi Online Chronicles book number 1 with a score of 7 out of 10, but it's definitely one of the better stories I've read, the last couple weeks. So there you go. Okay, on to our next review. It is Mitigating Risk, Nora Hazard, book number 1 by Blaze Corvin, a Ludus story. That's kind of what he's titling all these different series, I think, that he's doing for the Delvers LOC universe. It is 238 pages. Well, I should say it's 230 pages when I first saw it on Amazon. It now says it's 400 pages when I checked on it again. It's $4.90 if I'm killing me. So I'm not sure if Amazon just adjusted the page count or if whatever happened. So I think it's more likely towards the 238 page as opposed to the 400, but it's an enjoyable story either way. Here's the author's description. Warning, Nora Hazard's story begins over 3 years prior to the events of Delvers LOC. Welcome to Ludus. So that's the author's telling you where in the timeline that this story takes place. Here's the description. On Ludus, life is often cheap. Nora's childhood hadn't given her many options. With nowhere else to go after losing her family, she had joined an old friend in a street gang and found an unlikely home there. But unfortunately, tragedy is about to befall Nora. Grudges from the distant past and movements of shadowy organizations may take away everything she's familiar with and all that she holds dear, possibly even her life. Danger has never stopped her before, but survival may require escaping from her old life and embarking on an insane, desperate journey. On the way, she might even accidentally stumble into both an incredible opportunity and an incredible burden. Unfortunately for her enemies, Nora was no pushover before, and that was before discovering her superpowers. Okay, so that last little description kind of tells you something about the game mechanics and story. Now, I like this story. I'm a big fan of Blaze Corvin's. I love the Delvers LOC universe, Secret of the Old Ones, all that stuff. He's a good writer for me. And this one is probably one of the better stories that I think he's written. And I'll say that for a couple of reasons. One, this novel almost feels like a short story. The page length is what it is. It's either whatever it's actually going to be. But it went by so fast for me that I feel like, it felt like a very efficient story, and I mean that in the best way possible. This is probably the most efficient story I've ever read from Blaze Corbin. It sets up the backstory and empathy for the main character and world building within the first 25% of the novel, and then it gets right into the game mechanics and the world building explanation, what Ludus is, how the orbs work, the whole system, and it's done just so efficient. I was genuinely impressed. And then it gets straight into butt kicking. The main character starts kicking butt, taking names, and going on a bunch of interesting adventures. And all of it's done without ever really get boring or getting cluttered. Like I said, this is a very efficient novel, and I say that with great respect, because I don't think I could write this efficiently. I'm a witty writer, and Blaze just he knocked it out as far as getting the points that he wants across and describing how the world works and how the orb system works. Super well done, I have to say. And the novel just kind of flies by as you read it, or at least it did for me. Now, you don't have to have read Delvers LOC to actually read this novel. The author does a really great job of explaining how the world works, what this whole thing is about, what's up with the god, and how he's teleporting people from Earth. All that's really well explained, and so you don't actually have to have read Delvers LOC to read this novel. So don't let that stop you if you've never read anything by Blaze Corbin. This is a great standalone novel, and I think you'll enjoy it just as it is. The game mechanics are there. They're the same as they are for Delvers LOC, so don't expect anything super different. And it's good stuff all around. The novel does slow down a little bit towards the middle, but other than that, it's super fast paced. The action in the story is always top notch. Blaze Corbin does a really good job of describing action scenes and making them feel visceral and just good times, good actiony stuff. And so I can, and if you've read Delvers LOC, you're going to get a lot of nods and story points from there. Oh, I see where that character came from, or that's a cameo for somebody I like, or oh, I see how the storyline's going to tie in eventually to Delvers LOC, and a bunch of good cool stuff like that. But even, again, if you don't have to have read Delvers LOC, you just get a little bit more from it if you have. But for me, great action story. Gets a score of 7 out of 10 for me. That's Mitigating Risk, Nora Hazard, Book 1, with a score of 7 out of 10. So there we go. Okay, easy review. On to another second episode, another existing series. This one is Warriors Academy, The Heroic Trio, episode number 2 by G.L. Rathwig. This one is 291 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Okay, let's see. Here's the author's description. After the world is destroyed, humanity's survivors start anew. Now, in a world forever changed, a place where magic is real and monsters have come to life, a place where magic and science blend with pop culture, welcome to Warrior Academy. Welcome back to Warrior Academy. Rejoin Hero and his friends as they continue their journey, meet new friends and enemies, more food, more fighting, more music. If you like video games, music, anime, and pop culture in general, you will love Warrior Academy. It's Harry Potter meets Naruto with a little Dragon Ball Z, and Dungeons & Dragons thrown in for fun. And don't forget a smattering of High School Musical. So there you go. That's the author's bid for it. And he also, again, he incorporated a YouTube and Spotify playlist that you can play as you listen to the novel if you're into incorporating music into your listening and reading preferences. Okay, basically this is a slice of life novel that reads like mashup fanfiction in a good way. It's set in a future again where there's a cataclysm that just brought out a bunch of monsters and great evils, and the few human survivors also became empowered and with the ability to fight monsters. Then they created a mashup of like stuff they pulled from anime and manga and created actual powers there. So you get things like the Belmont clan, and you get like teachers named Professor Strange and old wise martial art instructors named Roshi. And there's a ton of like anime, pop culture, and manga references. So if you're into that kind of stuff, this is definitely a big rally. It combines that with like this academy where the kids of these powered people go to learn and to kind of learn to mesh with each other, and they compete with each other to create more powerful. And there's a whole thing there. The main character has a tragic past that is gradually revealed in flashback chapters, which I thought was really cool. It's a really cool way that the author like reveals backstory for the main characters in all of his stuff. He's attending high school where he again competes with other teens like him, and it's just kind of an excuse to have them compete and show like really flashy powers and do some crafting, and it's fun stuff. In this episode, there's also the introduction of a sport that gets people into like these teams and inter-school competition. And it's again, mostly just slice of life stuff, school rivalry, crafting. You even get like a development of larger plot points for the series that are planned. But overall, it's just like fun parody stuff. There are RPG mechanics and like increasing your ranks and powers and abilities and crafting and stuff. So all that's there, but it is kind of on the lighter side. And again, if you like the characters in the story, you'll have a fun time with it. If you haven't read book one, you're probably, this is kind of like a weird place to jump into it. It's one of those novels, like if you're into these characters, if you're into this world, you're probably like everything in this series. And this is the case. I liked it. I liked the first episode in the series, and I like slice of life adventure stories. And so this one kind of worked for me. It gets a score of 7 out of 10. That's Warrior Academy, the Heroic Trio, episode number 2, with a score of 7 out of 10. Easy review. One more. This is it, folks. This is the last review. It is Restart, Dark Paladin, book number 3 by Vasily Mahenko. He's the author of the Way of the Shaman series. And this is apparently the last book in this series, according to what the author wrote at the back of this novel. So here it is, folks. This will give you a conclusion. But there's also potential for it to be continued later on if the author wishes it to. It is 323 pages. It is $5.99. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited. So for that price point, if you're not a fan of this series, don't pick it up, please. This is a hard book to jump into. This is a hard book in general, a hard series to get into, and I'll explain why in a minute. But read book 1. If you like the characters and the world works for you, great. Pick up books 2 and 3. But this is not the kind of series where you can just pick up book 3 and have a good time. There's just way too much weird stuff and things that are hard to understand happening. So just be aware of that. Here is the author's description. The game is in turmoil. All the players' strength and resources are invested in preparing for Restart. Only 20% of the players will make it to the next area. Murderers are becoming more commonplace. Bribes and nepotism are at their height. Betrayal is becoming an inherent part of everyday decisions. The game has spread its influence, there's a big word there, I can't, to the farthest corners of the universe, affecting every sentient being. Will the Dark Judge reach the right verdict? Will he follow the ideas of his class to the end, or will he reject them, becoming an ordinary player? Yarpolk must make a fateful choice. He is the guide, the one who will launch the restart. Okay. Honestly, when I started reading this, it kind of took me a long time to remember who everybody is. There's a lot of characters in this novel, and the author doesn't have a glossary telling you who they are. So if you haven't read book 2 or book 1 recently, it'll take you a little while just to remember who everybody is. But once I was there, I was like, it jogged my memory. I was like, I had to read my review just to kind of remember what happened. I had a good time. It's a fine story. If you're into this series, if you like this world, it's another one of those if you're into it, great. If you're not, you're not going to like this. If you don't like book 1, there's no way in heck you're going to like book 2 or 3. And this is not the kind of series again that you can pick up in book 3 and understand anything what's happening. It's kind of complicated. And even if you've read book 1 and 2, it's still complicated. It just as the book goes on, there are just a lot of stuff that's happening. Basically, the fundamental concept of the story of the series is that our world is really a game. And then there's a whole hidden gain system underneath our regular world. Like, we're all NPCs apparently, and there are specific players who play this game underneath the world, and only they can kind of see it. The rest of us just kind of go about our day ignoring it, and it doesn't matter to us. Like, if we die as NPCs, we'll just be respawned as something else. And so up until now, the main character has just been trying to grasp it all. He went to a school, and then he went to the real world, and he saw the more complicated levels that this game is. And he's just been kind of like get a hold of money, get a class, get a job, granted some levels, just so he's not like murdered and killed by this competitive, like dark versus light kind of nature. Only now, here's the rub, like all the conditions to reset everything, the big reset and start over have been met. The big question is, like, if this restart happens, who's going to get determined what the new game is like? And also only a certain percentage of the players in the entire world are going to get to like go into the new edition. And so there's like this big, huge competition, like people murdering each other and wiping them out, so that if restart happens, they have a better chance of surviving because there are less people around. And so there's a lot of fighting for the spots. And the series in general is just, it's a hard series to get into. Like, The Way of the Shaman is relatively easy for people to pick up because the game rules there are based on the author's experience with World of Warcraft. And so you see a lot of those influence in, and a lot of those game rules make sense because there are things, other games and other systems that people can reference. That is not the case here. Like, this entire rule set for this world, all the social situations, all the political aspects, all the light versus dark mana, the various classes and the various jobs, and the bigger themes, they're all custom made. And so it's much harder for people to just kind of like fall into because they have fewer places to like connect and reference. So if you like those game rules that are established here, great, you love the series. But if you don't like those game mechanics and you don't like how the world is kind of set up, there's no way you're going to enjoy this. And that's just kind of the way this series is. And there's even like this whole weird plot scheme about archetypes like Merlin and the Madonna, and them being other reincarnations, and the main character being the guide and having to decide who they are and coming together to restart the world. There's a whole thing. I mean, it's a genuinely complex story, but if you like it, you will really love it. And if you don't like it, you don't at all. And so it's just a harder thing. So I would always suggest go read book 1. If you like it, great. You're going to like book 2 and 3. If you don't, you're not. And that's just kind of the way it is for this one. This is the last book in the series. It had a really interesting ending, I thought, at least for me. It wrapped everything up real nicely. But it, again, left potential for this series to continue. And I liked the way it ended. I'm also, I'm crazy enough, I think, to enjoy the style that the author does. Like, this whole series, if you've read the Way of the Shaman series, here's the comparison I can give you to kind of know what to expect in the series. Remember, like, as the series goes on, it gets more and more complicated. Like, the author starts introducing guild factions and a bunch of other things. And that's the way the entire series, like, it starts complicated. Like, you can tell, like, the author was just being creative and he wanted to create his own rules without having to, like, be constricted by this fantasy MMO thing necessarily. And it's this interesting project. And again, I liked it, so I was into it, but not everybody is. It's a much harder series to get into than like The Way of the Shaman. So, but for me, I had a good time. 7 out of 10, easy review. Restart The Dark Paladin book number 3 with a score of a 7 out of 10. So there you go. That's it. We're done. Ladies and gentlemen, that's 10 whole reviews. Went a little long just because we had that great, episode number 100 stuff going on there. So thanks again for listening, for watching. Remember, if you want to follow us, or you can do so on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Patreon. You can find all the ways to support the podcasts in any way you want to do so at litrpgpodcast.com/support. And again, thanks everybody for hanging out with me today and for hanging out with me for like 100 episodes of this particular show. It's been a super great long journey, and I'm hoping to go for another 2 or 300 or 400. And hopefully you're all going to come along for the ride, and we're all going to be able to enjoy LitRPG for all that entire time. But until we can hang out again, ladies and gentlemen, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.